The summer heat pressed down on Copper Ridge, Montana, that Saturday morning in late July. Inside the dusty livestock auction barn, Della Brennan sat alone in the back row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. At 53 years old, she had learned to make herself invisible in crowds like this, to avoid the stares and whispered comments that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her denim shirt was neat and pressed, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, but she knew what people saw when they looked at her. She had spent a lifetime knowing. The $3,000 in her savings account, carefully set aside over 2 years from her job at the town library, felt like both a fortune and a foolish dream. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speakers as horses were led through the ring one by one, beautiful creatures finding buyers within minutes. Then Lot 47 appeared, a bay gelding that made the crowd fall silent. The horse was magnificent despite his obvious neglect, his dark brown coat dull and matted, ribs visible beneath the skin, but his eyes held an intelligence that took Della's breath away. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer dropped the price from $500 to $400, then to $300. Della's hand rose, almost of its own accord. The horse turned his head, and for just a moment, his dark eyes met hers across the crowded space. In that instant, she saw something she recognized, loneliness and the weight of being judged and found wanting. From somewhere near the front, a man's voice carried through the barn. "Well, I guess that makes sense. 2 big projects nobody else wants." Laughter rippled through sections of the crowd. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold for $300. As Della made her way to complete the paperwork, whispers followed her like a wake. A group of younger ranchers stood near the door. "That horse is half dead," one said. "Maybe they can dye it together," another replied, and they all laughed. Outside, the stable hand waited with the horse. "Name's on the paperwork as Maverick," he said. "He came from the Whitmore estate sale. Everything went to auction after old Mr. Whitmore passed last month." Della's heart skipped a beat. The Whitmore Ranch, where she had spent the happiest summer of her life at 17, before everything changed. Maverick lowered his head and exhaled softly, his warm breath touching her hand. Standing there in the parking lot, Della made a silent promise to this horse and to herself. She would prove them all wrong. The question that hung in the air was whether faith alone would be enough to turn $300 and 2 broken spirits into something worth believing in. The old trailer rattled behind Della's pickup truck as she drove down the winding dirt road toward her small property on the outskirts of Copper Ridge. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Behind her, she could hear Maverick shifting his weight, the sound making her heart race with worry. She had never transported a horse before, had barely known how to load him into the borrowed trailer. Ren Carmichael, her neighbor, had agreed to let her use it, though the skepticism in the woman's eyes had been impossible to miss. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold that should have felt peaceful but only amplified the anxiety churning in Della's stomach. Her property was modest, just 5 acres with a small wooden house her grandmother had left her 10 years ago. There was an old barn that hadn't housed animals in decades, its red paint faded and peeling, the structure leaning slightly to one side as if tired from years of standing alone. Della had walked through it last week with a flashlight, checking the stalls and the roof, telling herself it would be good enough. Now, pulling up to it with an actual horse in tow, it looked far more broken down than she remembered. Doubt crept in like cold water seeping through cracks. She parked and sat for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. Through the rearview mirror, she could see Maverick's dark eye watching her, patient and calm despite everything he had been through. That look gave her courage. Della climbed out of the truck and walked around to the trailer, her boots crunching on the gravel. When she opened the door and lowered the ramp, Maverick backed out carefully, his movements stiff and cautious. Standing together in her driveway, both of them seemed to take in their new reality. The barn door creaked loudly as Della pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, Dust particles danced in the streams of fading sunlight that filtered through gaps in the walls. She had prepared one stall as best she could, laying down fresh straw she'd purchased that morning, filling a water bucket, and hanging a hay net she'd watched 3 YouTube videos to learn how to tie properly. It wasn't much, but it was clean and dry. Maverick followed her inside without resistance, as if he understood this was meant to be home. Della led him into the stall and removed the halter with trembling fingers. The horse immediately moved to the water bucket and drank deeply, and something about that simple act of trust made tears spring to Della's eyes. She had done this. Against every voice of doubt and ridicule, she had brought this animal home. As darkness settled over Copper Ridge, Della stood in the barn doorway watching Maverick settle into the straw. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her daughter Iris. "Mom, please tell me you didn't actually buy that horse." Della stared at the message for a long moment before turning off her phone. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine, but tonight, in the quiet of the barn with only the sound of Maverick's gentle breathing, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had made the right choice. What she didn't know was that by morning, everything would become far more complicated than she ever expected. Dawn broke over Copper Ridge with a chill that reminded Della summer wouldn't last forever. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions she didn't have answers to. What did horses eat besides hay? How much water did they need? What if Maverick got sick? At 5 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and pulled on her boots, heading to the barn with a flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Her heart hammered with fear of what she might find, images of disaster playing through her tired mind. Maverick was standing in his stall, alert and calm, his dark eyes following her movements as she approached. Relief flooded through Della so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. He nickered softly, a sound she had never heard before but somehow understood as a greeting. She opened the stall door carefully and stepped inside, her hand reaching out to touch his neck. His coat was rough and dirty under her fingers, but he was warm and alive and real. For several minutes, they simply stood together in the quiet barn, two souls finding comfort in not being alone. By 7 o'clock, Della was at the Copper Ridge Feed and Supply, a list clutched in her hand that she'd compiled from late-night internet searches. The store smelled of leather and grain, walls lined with equipment she couldn't name. Boone Mercer stood behind the counter, a weathered man in his 60s with sharp eyes that took in everything. He watched her approach with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Help you with something?" His voice was neutral, but Della sensed the judgment lurking beneath. "I need supplies for a horse," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Brushes, hoof pick, feed, supplements." The words felt foreign in her mouth. Boone's eyebrows rose slightly. "You the woman who bought that Whitmore horse yesterday?" News traveled fast in small towns. Della lifted her chin. "Yes, that's me." Boone studied her for a long moment, and Della braced herself for the mockery she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, he nodded slowly and moved from behind the counter. "That horse is in rough shape. You're going to need more than basic supplies. You got a veterinarian lined up?" The question hit Della like cold water. A veterinarian. Of course she needed a veterinarian. Why hadn't she thought of that? "Not yet," she admitted, her confidence crumbling. Boone pulled a business card from a holder on the counter. "Dr. Cole Ashford. Best horse vet in 3 counties. Tell him I sent you." He paused, his expression softening just slightly. That Whitmore horse, Maverick, he was something special once. Shame what happened to him. Before Della could ask what he meant, the bell above the door chimed. A woman walked in, tall and elegant in expensive riding clothes, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. Georgina Prescott. Della recognized her from the auction, the woman who had turned around to stare. Their eyes met, and something cold passed between them that made Della's stomach tighten with dread. Dr. Cole Ashford arrived at Della's property Tuesday morning in a dusty blue truck, his veterinary equipment loaded in the bed. He was younger than Della expected, maybe 45, with kind gray eyes and an easy manner that immediately put her at ease. As he walked toward the barn, his boots leaving prints in the morning dew, Della felt her anxiety spike. What if Maverick was beyond help? What if she had made a terrible mistake buying a horse that was too far gone? Maverick stood quietly as Dr. Ashford examined him, the veterinarian's hands moving with practiced skill over the horse's body. Della watched from the stall door, holding her breath, reading every expression that crossed the doctor's face. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Ashford straightened up and turned to her. He's malnourished and his hooves are in bad shape, but there's no permanent damage I can see. With proper care and feeding, he should make a full recovery. The relief that washed over Della was so intense she had to grip the stall door to steady herself. However, Dr. Ashford continued, his tone becoming more serious, there's something you should know about this horse. Maverick wasn't just any horse at the Whitmore estate. He was Sterling Whitmore's personal mount, trained for competitive jumping. Worth about $30,000 in his prime. Della's mind reeled. $30,000. She had bought him for $300. Dr. Ashford's expression grew darker. When old Mr. Whitmore died, Sterling inherited everything but wanted nothing to do with the ranch or the horses. Word is he deliberately neglected them out of spite toward his father. Maverick suffered the most because he was the favorite. The cruelty of it made Della's chest tighten with anger. How could someone hurt an innocent animal out of bitterness? Dr. Ashford seemed to read her thoughts. Sterling's in town, heard he's been asking around about who bought his father's horses. I don't know what his interest is, but I'd be careful. A warning hung in the air between them. Over the next week, Della fell into a routine that exhausted and exhilarated her in equal measure. She woke before dawn to feed Maverick, spent her lunch breaks at the library researching horse care, and rushed home each evening to groom him and check his progress. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, changes began to appear. His coat started to show hints of shine beneath the dirt. His eyes grew brighter, more alert. He began to nicker when he heard her truck coming up the drive. But as Maverick grew stronger, the whispers around town grew louder. At the library, Della overheard patrons talking about that woman with the fancy horse she can't handle. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when she walked down the aisle. And then Friday afternoon, a silver Mercedes pulled up her driveway. Sterling Whitmore had come calling, and the look on his face promised trouble neither Della nor Maverick needed. Sterling Whitmore stepped out of his Mercedes with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. He was tall and handsome in an artificial way, his dark suit far too expensive for a casual visit to a small property on the edge of town. Della watched him approach from her porch, her heart pounding but her feet planted firmly. She had dealt with men like Sterling before, men who looked at her and saw someone they could dismiss or intimidate. She refused to be either. "Miss Brennan, I presume," Sterling said, not offering his hand. His eyes swept over her property with barely concealed disdain before settling on the barn. "I understand you purchased a horse at auction last week. A bay gelding named Maverick." His voice was smooth but carried an edge that made Della's instincts scream danger. "I'm prepared to offer you $1,000 for him." "That's more than triple what you paid." Della felt her jaw tighten. "Maverick's not for sale." The words came out stronger than she expected, surprising even herself. Sterling's expression hardened, the polite mask slipping to reveal something cold underneath. "That horse belonged to my father. He has sentimental value to my family." The lie was so transparent Della almost laughed. Dr. Ashford had told her the truth. Sterling had deliberately neglected these animals out of spite. "If he had sentimental value, you wouldn't have let him starve," Della said quietly. The air between them crackled with tension. Sterling took a step closer. His presence meant to intimidate. "Miss Brennan, I don't think you understand the situation. That's a highly trained jumping horse worth serious money. You're in over your head with an animal you can't possibly manage." His eyes traveled over her body with calculated cruelty. "Let's be honest, you're not exactly built for riding." The familiar shame tried to rise up, the old instinct to shrink and apologize for existing. But something had changed in Della over the past week. She had made a promise to Maverick and to herself. "I said he's not for sale. I'll have to ask you to leave my property." Her voice didn't waver despite the fear coursing through her veins. Sterling's face flushed with anger. "You're making a mistake. That horse is dangerous, unpredictable. When he hurts you, and he will, don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked back to his car, but paused before getting in. "I'll be back, Miss Brennan. And next time, I won't be asking." The Mercedes kicked up dust as it roared down the driveway, leaving Della standing alone, shaking not from fear but from adrenaline and something that felt dangerously close to triumph. She had stood her ground, but Sterling's parting words echoed in her mind with an ominous weight that suggested this battle had only just begun. Sleep became a luxury Della could no longer afford. Sterling's threat played on repeat in her mind, mixing with doubts she thought she had conquered. At 3 in the morning, she found herself in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket outside Maverick's stall, watching him sleep. The horse's breathing was steady and peaceful, a sound that somehow calmed the storm raging inside her. She knew she needed help, real help, if she was going to protect both of them from whatever Sterling was planning. Thursday morning, Della swallowed her pride and called Hawk Sullivan, the horse trainer whose number Dr. Ashford had given her. Hawk arrived that afternoon in a battered pickup truck, a lean man in his early 50s with sun-weathered skin and observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He spent 20 minutes just watching Maverick move around the paddock Della had hastily repaired, not saying a word, his expression impossible to read. "He remembers," Hawk finally said, leaning against the fence. "See how he moves. That's not just a horse walking around. That's an athlete who knows what he used to be." He turned to Della with an intensity that made her nervous. "Question is, do you have what it takes to help him remember fully? Because that's going to require you getting on his back eventually." The thought terrified Della. She had never ridden a horse in her life. Over the next 2 weeks, Hawk came 3 times a week, teaching Della the basics. How to read Maverick's body language, how to establish trust through groundwork, how to move with confidence even when fear screamed inside her. The work was exhausting and humbling. Della fell more times than she could count, her body aching in places she didn't know existed, but each time she got back up. Maverick seemed to understand they were learning together. He was patient with her mistakes, gentle when she fumbled with equipment, responsive to her growing confidence. Their bond deepened with each passing day, built on mutual respect and an understanding that transcended words. Della found herself talking to him in the quiet barn, sharing fears and dreams she had never spoken aloud to another soul. But as their connection grew stronger, so did the tension in town. Anonymous notes began appearing in Della's mailbox, warning her to sell the horse before something bad happened. And then one morning, she woke to find her barn door hanging open and Maverick gone. Panic seized Della's chest like a vice as she ran through the empty barn, calling Maverick's name. The stall door was open, the gate to the paddock swinging loose in the morning breeze. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately let him out, or worse, taken him. Her hands shook as she dialed Hawk's number, her voice breaking as she explained what happened. Within an hour, half the town seemed to know. Hawk arrived first, followed by Dr. Ashford and, surprisingly, Ren Carmichael and Boone Mercer. Even some people Della had never spoken to showed up to help search. They spread out across the countryside, calling Maverick's name, checking neighboring properties and the woods that bordered her land. Della felt sick with guilt and fear. She had promised to protect him. 3 hours into the search, as hope began to fade and Della's imagination conjured increasingly terrible scenarios, Wren's voice crackled over the radio. Found him. Old Whitmore property, near the creek. Della's heart leaped. She drove faster than she should have, gravel spraying behind her tires, barely able to breathe until she saw him standing by the water, grazing peacefully as if nothing had happened. Maverick lifted his head when he heard her voice and walked toward her without hesitation. Della wrapped her arms around his neck and let the tears come, relief and anger and love mixing together. Hawk examined the horse carefully, checking for injuries. He's fine. Looks like he just walked here on his own. His eyes met Della's with meaning. This is where the Whitmore training ring used to be. He came home to the only home he remembered. The realization hit Della hard. Maverick had been searching for something he lost, just like she had been. But as they loaded him into the trailer, Della noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud near the gate. Someone had been here recently, watching and waiting. Sterling's warning echoed in her mind, and she knew with chilling certainty that this wasn't over. The real test was still coming. That evening, as Della secured every lock on the barn twice over, Wren Carmichael appeared at her door holding a manila envelope. The older woman's face was grave, her usual warm demeanor replaced by something darker. "There's something you need to know about Sterling Whitmore and that horse," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. What Wren revealed over the next hour shattered everything Della thought she understood. Sterling's father, Victor Whitmore, had been a champion equestrian who poured his heart into training Maverick for national competitions. But Sterling had always resented the attention his father gave the horses, the way Victor seemed to love them more than his own son. When Victor fell ill 3 years ago, Sterling convinced him to sign over power of attorney, promising to care for the estate. Instead, he systematically destroyed everything his father loved, selling off land, firing staff, and neglecting the animals. Maverick, Victor's pride and joy, suffered most of all. Victor died knowing what Sterling had done, Wren said, her voice thick with emotion. He changed his will 2 weeks before he passed, leaving a clause that if Maverick was ever sold, the new owner would inherit a trust fund meant for the horse's care. $50,000. Della's hands went numb. $50,000. That's why Sterling wanted Maverick back. Not for sentiment, but to access money he felt entitled to. The next morning, Della received a certified letter from Sterling's lawyer demanding she return Maverick, claiming the auction sale was invalid due to estate complications. The legal language was intimidating, designed to scare her into compliance. But Della had spent her life being underestimated, and she was done backing down. She called the only lawyer she knew, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen who had helped with her grandmother's estate. Patricia reviewed the documents and smiled. "He has no case. The sale was legal, and that trust fund is yours to use for Maverick's care. But Della, men like Sterling don't give up easily." Her warning proved prophetic when that night, Della woke to the smell of smoke and realized her barn was on fire. Della ran barefoot across the gravel, her lungs burning as smoke poured from the barn's western corner. Flames licked up the wooden walls, orange and hungry in the darkness. Her only thought was Maverick. She grabbed the fire extinguisher from her porch and sprayed it at the flames while dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The fire department was 20 minutes away. 20 minutes that felt like a lifetime as she fought to reach the stall door. Maverick was panicked, his eyes wide with terror, but when he heard Della's voice cutting through the chaos, something in him steadied. She threw open the stall door, and he bolted past her into the safety of the night. Della collapsed on the ground, coughing and crying, watching firefighters arrive to save what little remained of her barn. By dawn, the structure was a blackened skeleton, smoke still rising from the rubble. Everything was gone, the equipment, the supplies, 2 months of hard work reduced to ash. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw questioned her as the sun rose, his weathered face grim. Della told him about Sterling's threats, the mysterious notes, the opened gate. The sheriff nodded slowly. "We'll investigate, Miss Brennan, but proving arson is difficult. I'll have a talk with Mr. Whitmore." His tone suggested he knew exactly who was responsible but lacked the evidence to act. Della felt the injustice of it burning hotter than the fire had. What happened next surprised everyone, including Della. News of the fire spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire itself, and by noon, trucks started arriving at her property. Boone Mercer brought lumber. Hawk Sullivan arrived with tools and a crew of ranchers. Wren Carmichael organized food and supplies. Even people who had laughed at her at the auction showed up, shamefaced but ready to help rebuild. Dr. Ashford examined Maverick thoroughly and declared him unharmed, just shaken. As Della stood watching her community raise a new barn from the ruins of the old one, she realized something profound had shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found her tribe, people who saw past surface judgments to the courage underneath. By week's end, a stronger, better barn stood where the old one had been. But Sterling Whitmore wasn't finished. On Friday afternoon, he arrived with the sheriff and a court order, claiming Della was an unfit guardian who had endangered the horse. His face held a triumphant smirk as he announced he was taking Maverick back, and this time, there was nothing she could do to stop him. Della stood between Sterling and Maverick, her body trembling but her voice steady. "You're not taking him." The crowd that had gathered to help rebuild fell silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Sheriff Bradshaw looked uncomfortable, the court order in his hand feeling heavier by the second. Sterling's smirk widened. "The judge agreed you're unable to provide proper care. The fire proved that." His words were calculated to wound, and they did. But then Patricia Chen's car pulled up the driveway, and behind her came 3 more vehicles. Out stepped Victor Whitmore's former ranch manager, his head groom, and his longtime friend, Judge Harold Morrison, now retired. Patricia held up a folder thick with documents. "Sheriff, before you enforce that order, you need to see this." Victor Whitmore's original will, witnessed and notarized, explicitly states that Maverick can never be returned to Sterling under any circumstances. He knew his son's character. The ranch manager stepped forward, his voice carrying across the yard. "I watched Sterling starve those horses deliberately. I have photos, vet records, everything documented before he fired me. Victor made me promise to protect Maverick if anything happened." One by one, the witnesses spoke, painting a picture of cruelty and greed that left Sterling's face red with fury and the sheriff shaking his head. Judge Morrison's testimony sealed it. "Victor came to me before he died, heartbroken about what his son had become. He set up that trust specifically to ensure Maverick would be cared for by someone who loved horses, not someone who saw them as assets." He looked at Della with respect. "Miss Brennan, Victor would be proud of what you've done." The sheriff handed the court order back to Sterling. "This changes things. I can't enforce this." Sterling's mask finally cracked completely. "She's nothing. She doesn't deserve that horse or that money. I'm his son." The ugly truth spilled out in front of everyone, revealing the entitlement and bitterness that had driven him. He stormed off, making threats that rang hollow now, everyone seeing him for what he truly was. 3 months later, Della stood in the rebuilt barn, watching Maverick move with the grace and power of the champion he had once been. Hawk had been training them both, and today, for the first time, Della would ride him properly. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. As she settled into the saddle and Maverick began to move beneath her, responding to her gentle cues with trust and strength, Della understood something profound. They had saved each other. 2 souls dismissed and discarded by the world had found worth in one another, proving that value isn't measured by appearance or by what others think, but by the courage to keep standing when everything says to fall. Her daughter Iris had finally visited, tears in her eyes as she apologized for not believing. The town that once mocked her now greeted her with respect. And Maverick, the broken horse nobody wanted, was whole again, carrying a woman who had learned she was never broken at all, just waiting for the moment to prove everyone wrong. Together, they had found home.